Rob Henderson is not just a well-known internet writer, he's also a former soldier in the U.S. Air Force. He holds a doctorate in psychology from Cambridge University. He's currently a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and is a best-selling author of the great recent book, Troubled. And I've been a longtime subscriber of Rob's excellent newsletter on Substack. So when I met Rob at an event earlier in this year and I discovered he's a Cost of Glory fan, I thought that I got to get this guy on the show and talk about some of our many, many mutual interests. So welcome to the Cost of Glory, Rob.
Hey, thanks, Alex. Great to be here. I will say, my military friends would get on me about this, that I was in the Air Force, but service members in the Air Force are usually not described as soldiers. This is just one of those things that only people in the military care about. So soldiers are in the Army, and the Marines, obviously the Marines, Navy, sailors, and then Air Force, usually airmen. But I will say a soldier sounds cooler than airman, so we can. I won't get too upset about it.
Well, you'll always be a soldier to me, and to those that you're not a soldier, I'm sure that they care a hell of a lot about those terms. So it's good to get them right. Well, I thought we could start by the subject that I was thinking about, because in a lot of your writing, you focus on social emotions, the psychology of relationships, including gender, very interesting stuff and timely. But in my experience in academia, your field is psychology, and psychology often tends to be sort of presentist, looking at validated empirical studies over the past 50 years, if that. And, they don't like to look back into history necessarily, because where are the stats, where are the control groups? But in your newsletters and your writing, you often bring up great historical examples, Julius Caesar, Cassius, Machiavelli. So I wanted to ask you, what do you like to read from the past, and especially why?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. And you are right. In the field of psychology, there is this, the never ending now. What's the recent study? What's the latest? What's the, most recently published meta-analysis? What's preprints? There's this obsession with, the present and the immediate future. I experienced this when I was in my PhD program at Cambridge in England. And even there was this, around that time, this was the late 2010s. So I arrived 2018, 2019, and there was this preoccupation of, studying what's going on with the Trump voter. How did Trump get elected? And that's all anyone cared about. And then a variation of that in the UK was, what happened with the Brexit voter? That's all anyone cared about, was this very immediate political event. And then all the psychologists snapped into action and ran a bunch of studies just focusing on that. And that was one reason, among others, why, there are a lot of reasons, but that was one of them for why I decided not to pursue a career in academia, was just this obsession with what's the trending topic, what's fashionable to study right now, rather than kind of these deeper lessons that we might be able to draw from human nature. So when I was in undergrad, I studied under the historian John Lewis Gaddis. And in his classes, he had us read some of the classics. One of my favorites was Machiavelli. And Machiavelli has this very nice quote in the Discourses. He says, this is Machiavelli: everything that occurs in the world in every epoch has something that corresponds to it in the ancient times. The reason is that these things were done by men who have and have always had the same passions. And, I think that strikes at something here that, if you read enough history, if you go back far enough, you'll start to see patterns recur and reveal things that you wouldn't necessarily get in an online study that, you slap together and recruit 300 or 400 participants and have them answer a series of surveys. But, I have this internal tension, because whenever I'm around psychologists and academics, sociologists, and they're talking about something, I think okay, well, big deal. You ran a study with a few hundred people. Does this really tell us anything important? And I think about, history, I think about philosophy and the humanities and how that can be more informative. But then when I'm around philosophers and historians and so on, and they're making these sweeping claims, I'm thinking like, yeah, but what's the empirical data for this? You're, using these historical studies, you're using case studies, and these are very vivid and interesting anecdotes, but, there's no, sociological framework. There's no theory here. And so this is why I like, sort of stepping in both worlds and being, I guess, a bit of like a novice, a dilettante in various sort of academic disciplines.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. But I think the results have been very interesting for me. And you've had a few pieces on Julius Caesar and especially his assassination.
Mm,
And you talk a lot in your newsletter about envy and the competitive emotions. And as you know, we're doing this long series on Julius Caesar, approaching the end of it, and I'm about to cover his untimely demise and try to hold back my tears like Mommsen did in front of his students. But like maybe we could talk a little bit about how you see the competitive emotions playing out in the basic Julius Caesar story, which is, Caesar wins the wars, he becomes the dictator for life, and he's
mm,
about to leave on his great campaign to crush the Parthians. He's getting uncomfortable in Rome for a lot of reasons, and he's almost out. And then you know, people that he pardoned and some close friends of his betray him, and they stab him on the Ides of March.
mm.
What are the motivations going into that in terms of what you discussed in your newsletter? And of course,
Yeah,
it's the Julius Caesar story from Shakespeare too. That should be
yeah.
more familiar to people.
Yeah. That's what I was drawing from when I was using that the assassination of Caesar as a springboard to explore some of these emotions that drive envy and drive political discontent. And my understanding is that the Julius Caesar play written by Shakespeare was based on Plutarch's Lives. So supposedly it has some basis in historical fact. And so in that story, Cassius recounts how when he and Caesar were little boys, they went swimming and Caesar nearly drowned, and Cassius rescued him, and he always felt this sense of superiority over Caesar as a result of this. Because he saw Caesar in this very vulnerable and panicked state, in a state that other people probably never saw Caesar in, so terrified for his life. And he rescues him and feels superior to him. And then later, Cassius observes as Caesar acquires political power and mass support and is victorious in various wars and wins mass popular support and becomes the leader of Rome. And, he's stewing from behind and experiences these pangs of envy. And envy in psychology is, this feeling that someone has something that you don't and you want to acquire that. Which is a little different from jealousy. People often conflate envy and jealousy. Jealousy is you have something and someone might take it from you and you feel protective over it. So, romantic jealousy, you have your wife and some guy's flirting with her and you're feeling jealous because she's your wife and this guy might take her. And then there's the flip side where, you might see a romantic couple and feel attraction to the woman and you wish you had her and not this other guy. That's kind of envy. And Cassius sees Caesar accruing all of this power and thinks, well, why not me? And he, people who only have like a superficial understanding of the story, they know about Brutus, but at least according to the Shakespeare play, it was actually Cassius who set things in motion. He and Brutus early in the play, they see these commoners decorating a statue of Shakespeare with these wreaths and celebrating, and there's this mass celebration in the streets, and these two are thinking, especially Cassius, why does this guy think he's such a big shot? These people don't understand who this guy really is, and they harass the commoners and bully them. And so there are kind of two different forms of envy. So one is what's often called like benevolent envy or positive envy, upward looking envy, which is you see someone who has something you don't and it inspires you to do something. you feel like, well, why don't I have that? And then it motivates you to level yourself up and to accomplish something. And then there's malicious envy, which is instead of leveling yourself up, you try to level the other person down. So you might try to take what they have from them, or even turn it into a kind of negative sum game where you would rather burn the resource that they have so that they don't have it, even if it means you don't have it. So there's zero sum, which is either I have it or you have it. And then there's negative sum, which is I'm going to destroy this resource so that neither of us have it and everyone is worse off as a result. And so I think there was a lot of malicious envy at play here around Caesar. And, on his part, maybe a bit of naivete, which we can get into, where he talks about, he wishes he had men around him who were fat, and how, is it right in the story that he wasn't he ignoring his wife's warnings? Am I getting that right?
Yeah, that's in Plutarch. Calpurnia is like, oh, I had a terrible dream, Caesar. Oh,
Yeah,
relax, baby. Yeah, no, and the soothsayer, of course, beware the Ides of March.
right.
All these warnings. And Plutarch loves to put these portents in, but
Mm-hmm.
they, I think that they can be kind of a stand-in for people's intuition that something's not right. They're just like, I don't know what it is. They're feeling a look they
Yeah.
got from this guy, and
Was the soothsayer a
provoking
woman?
dreams.
Do we know the
I think
soothsayer?
it's supposed to be a man
Okay,
for what it's worth. Although
interesting.
that you can have female soothsayers. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about the story with his wife, and there's a similar kind of story with Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of Singapore, and how when LKY was establishing sort of the beginnings of Singapore in the 60s and 70s, a lot of the government, there were attempts to infiltrate the Singaporean government by Maoists and communists, Mao sympathizers. And it was actually his wife, Chu, who warned him about this. Like, they would attend political gatherings and people would try to ingratiate themselves with LKY, and he would often be unaware of what was truly going on. And it would be his wife later that evening who would say, I don't trust this guy. I don't know why, but you need to watch out for that person. And so I think there is this interesting thing here, this maybe trope or pattern in either stories and in reality, that women have a kind of a deeper sense of potential betrayal and backstabbing.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And yeah, there's some quote from Lee Kuan Yew that he realized that you could never sleep on the communists. They're like always going to infiltrate. They're never going to go
Yeah.
away.
Yeah, well, he
Um,
writes about in his memoir about how, like, that was the only time he felt real fear, like that's kind of personal. I mean, he survived the Japanese occupation of Singapore, and that was kind of a visceral fear, but it was, and that was like an acute kind of fear. But he said he felt this sort of lingering, never-ending, dull sense of awareness and fear from the communists, because they would never relent, and that he had to take often sometimes extra legal means to purge them.
yeah. No, that is a kind of a trope though, and in a lot of these kind of tragic stories, a tragic Warner Cassandra in the Oresteia, warning Agamemnon, don't go into the room. Clytemnestra is preparing a bath for you, but it's she's going to murder you, and nobody listens. And I think in the murder of the Gracchi brothers too,
Hmm.
the mother was like, "Don't go down to the forum today. I just got a bad feeling." And there are other portents, um, but with Cassius, I think something kind of occurred to me, and I wonder if this is part of it. Like, so you see this with several of Caesar's officers. Another one is dead by the time the events happen in Shakespeare, but it's Labienus is Titus Labienus is his number one lieutenant in Gaul, and he is a brilliant kind of subordinate commander. But by the time the civil war breaks out between Caesar and Pompey, the Caesar's enemies basically get Labienus to flip because they're playing on his resentment of Caesar,
Hmm.
because he thinks, you know, I've won every battle that Caesar could have won. I've won, or that Caesar, you know, that I'm as good of a military commander as Caesar, and he has these kind of delusions of grandeur and becoming, Caesar's equal in Rome, and Caesar's a great military commander, but he's also an incredible politician. And so I think, was it Dunning-Kruger, like,
Mm.
somebody like Labienus or Cassius for that matter. Cassius is also like a very accomplished military commander, young and scrappy, but they have this sense that they're amazingly accomplished in one field. And then they say, well, what's this guy got that I haven't? Because, I'm just as accomplished in this field, but he's also got this other political talent that they don't really have evidence of having. I wonder if there's something kind of Dunning-Kruger about a lot of these envy stories, giving you this inflated sense of yourself. But I often think
Mm.
that, I wonder, like, the positive envy and the malignant
Malicious
envy,
end. Yeah.
envy. The ancients, as we've discussed, would probably, I think Aristotle would distinguish these, give them different names. Like, one is envy and another is just another thing entirely. Envy in Greek is phonos, and the other thing is zeal, zelos, or emulation, which
Mm.
is, as it describes it much as the way you put it. Envy is the pain felt when you see somebody else succeeding, not because you don't have it, but because they have it, and you want to deprive them of it. You want to knock them down to size. Zeal or emulation is the
Mm.
emotion that you see somebody succeeding and you have this pain that you don't have it, and it makes you want to achieve. But I often think that these things tend to be correlated in the same person. Like, the person who's very zealous tends to be very envious, but I'm not sure that that's right. And something that you discussed in what an article that you have on envy was like, certain traits tend toward positive envy, and one kind of hunger for prestige, and then certain traits tend toward a negative envy, a different kind of hunger for prestige, like dominance versus prestige. Is that
Mhm.
right, or could you flesh that out for us?
Yeah, yeah. So broadly, when evolutionary psychologists talk about status, they break it out into those two categories you mentioned. So there's dominance and then there's prestige. And dominance is like an older form of status seeking, and you can see it in non-human animals. You can see it in chimpanzee troops and gorilla harems, where and pecking orders among chickens. And you see people, or rather these animals going at each other, trying to establish who outranks who's in charge, who's second in command, kind of thing. And in humans, it takes the form of intimidation, bullying, violence, reputation destruction, gossip, those kinds of things. And, people acquire dominance through, those less savory means. So someone like Joseph Stalin acquired status through dominance. And then there's this other pathway to status, which is prestige. And this is acquired through essentially doing impressive things and making people want to be around you, doing things that are valuable to the group or that are impressive to the group. And so people acquire dominance because of, what you can do to them, inflict costs on them. Whereas prestige, people will confer status to you because of what you can do for them, teach them things, do things that impress them. Often if you hang out with a prestigious person, some of that status will rub off on you, which is, why you see, when people see celebrities, they want to take selfies with them and post it on social media. There's this kind of rubbing off of prestige. So someone like Stephen Hawking acquired status through prestige. Stephen Hawking very obviously didn't acquire status through dominance. He did it because he was smart and impressive and taught us new things about the universe. And so people who are more dominance oriented tend to experience that kind of malicious envy of wanting to level other people down, of wanting to coerce others into their way of doing things. And prestige is generally more associated with that positive form of envy of, wanting to level yourself up and wanting to acquire skills and talents and unique abilities so that people will want to be around you and freely confer status to you and allow you to influence them of their own free will and of their own accord. And this is maybe something else interesting about Caesar is that, obviously he won these wars and that was a kind of form of violence and domination. But at least the people of Rome, the citizens of Rome, he was prestigious to them. And these two categories, like with everything in the social sciences, these are not like airtight categories, neatly distinguishable from one another. So there can be examples of someone who acquires status through both dominance and prestige. So military members, generals, someone like Caesar, was a bit of both dominance and prestige. And in the modern day, something, depending on the political climate, police officers are often considered both dominant and prestigious. Where obviously there's that underlying threat of violence, but also this respect and esteem for the public duty and the service and that kind of thing.
Fascinating. I think you see this playing out in the Civil War strategies that both camps pursue because, Caesar Caesar has this kind of policy of mercy. People aren't sure at the beginning whether he's going to really do that. But the first victory he wins after he crosses the Rubicon, he surrounds a fortress in northern Italy and he gets them to surrender. And everybody's worried if they're all going to get their throats cut like Sulla did 20 years earlier. But Caesar spares them all and he even lets some of his opponents, his mortal enemies, go, and they go and join the rest of the army and end up fighting him more times in the war. But that's like a consistent policy of his, that he spares his enemies, that he's loved by the people of Rome generally. He has all of these Gauls in his army, of these people that he conquered, that he's kind of befriended. That's his policy. I don't want to have to bring the hammer down on you. We can do this the nice way or the hard way. But on the other side, the policy of the senatorial party in the Civil War, really exampled most brilliantly by Labienus, is when you capture Caesar's soldiers, you execute them all. Yeah. When you capture anybody from Caesar's side, if you get them in your hands, they get the sword. And, I think that it's a fair description that envy tended to motivate the senators and the Republican Party a lot more. Like, a lot of why they're fighting the war is that they resent the rise of Caesar, and they're kind of like, blown up version of Cassius's response to Caesar. They see him as the end of their dominance, they just can't stand that he's risen to the position that he has. Whereas I think that he's kind of more trying to win by being the most popular, and not just the most popular, but like he's a just lawgiver. He's a really, really competent administrator. He's sort of overwhelming the Roman state by his benefactions, not by his mercilessness. So it's interesting to see those things play out.
Which probably fed into the fear of him that so many people, like, he was beloved. And I wonder if, in some ways, if he was not so well liked and well regarded, if maybe he wouldn't have been assassinated because they would just assume he would make a misstep, or the people would overthrow him or something along those lines. But it was the very fact that he was beloved. And there's a story in, I think it's one of Robert Greene's books, maybe the 48 Laws, talks about Sir Walter Raleigh and how this guy was a sea captain. He was an all-around impressive guy. He did so many impressive things. He was the favorite of the Queen and so on. And ultimately, he was tried for treason under very flimsy circumstances, very flimsy evidence. And Greene interprets this as, they were just using this as a pretense. It wasn't real. They just hated this guy because he was so impressive, and because he made no effort to hide how impressive he was. He stirred up a lot of envy in people, and they took him out. And I think, there's probably something similar here going on with Caesar, that he was so impressive in so many different ways that it just aroused this intense feeling of resentment and bitterness in people. And interestingly, there is some fairly recent evidence in some psychology studies about when people choose to hide impressive things about themselves. And often people will, depending on the social circle they find themselves in, so there's one way you might think about people, which is like they always want to just show off and brag and talk about all the important and impressive things that they do because they want to be well liked and they want to be respected. But often, psychologists have pointed out that people will downplay their skills, make self-effacing jokes or self-deprecating remarks about themselves, or try not to brag too much depending on who they're around. And the idea here is people are often well aware of the dangers of envy, and they don't want to look too impressive, and they don't want to stand out too much to avoid, what I think it's in Australia, they call the tall poppy syndrome, where the tall poppy gets cut down. And different cultures have managed to exert various amounts of influence over this feeling of envy. There was this really funny finding years ago about this game show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And they have this the Ask the Audience lifeline, where you can ask the audience to help you with a question. And this study found that in the U.S., when contestants asked the audience, the majority answer that the audience suggested, it was right about 90% of the time. You could usually trust the audience to help you out. Whereas in Russia, their version of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, often contestants wouldn't even use that lifeline because the audience would give them the wrong answer on purpose because they didn't want to see them win. And, this is, and I wonder what that is. Like, I don't know Russian culture that well, if that is a kind of a lingering effect of communism where, the world becomes more cutthroat, resources are more scarce. And then also you don't want to stand out, you don't want to succeed, and you don't want to see others succeed either. And that's a surprisingly common impulse, which is probably one reason among others why communism as an ideology has flourished in so many cultures, sort of independently of one another. So, yeah, I just love the Caesar story because it's such a nice encapsulation of this, this impressive, powerful person who. We touched on this before about how he may have been a bit naive as a result of his growing power, that this is a danger of as you acquire power, you sort of lose sight of potential threats and dangers. And he did, at least in the Shakespeare telling of this story, he did talk about, how he wanted men around him who were fat. And his assumption was that lean men were more dangerous because they didn't obtain pleasure and joy through drinking and eating and through these kind of lavish parties and events, but they're more interested in power and in politicking and in acquiring influence. And that was pretty early in the story, if I recall. But then as he goes on and as he becomes more respected, he loses sight of the dangers around him and ignoring repeatedly these alerts and these alarms around him, the soothsayer and from his wife and so on.
Yeah, and that passage is in Plutarch, beware the lean man, not these chubby long-haired ones. But I think Shakespeare really fleshes out the implications of that more than Plutarch does. But this is an interesting phenomenon. So like Plutarch has this great treatise called How to Praise Oneself Without Giving Offense, and it's all about kind of dodging envy because self-praise is generally regarded as tasteless, but there's kind of clever ways to do it. Like if you're mounting a defense of yourself and that you've been subject to kind of unfair accusations, that's like the best place you can be in to kind of sing your own praises and talk about how good of a job you've done. Another way that he talks about is to give the credit to the gods. This is something that Sulla did a lot. It was all luck. It wasn't me. And it's a way of that I think you see in the kind of luxury belief world that you talk about in Trouble, that it's a way of kind of deflecting the envy of your peers to say that it wasn't, it wasn't really you doing this. But I think that in the Caesar story, you see the inklings of this, and it's a recurrent pattern also that you see a lot in Tacitus, the imperial author, talking about, the suspicious world of Tiberius and the early emperors. Like often flattery and praise is like a subtle attack by your enemies. They're trying to, praise you to the skies to provoke the envy, whether it's of the emperor or of the nobles. That I think this usually isn't the case, but with really sophisticated political operators, like a campaign of flattery and adulation can actually increase the chances that people will resent you and you'll lose popularity. It's really funny.
Yeah, I think I saw this. It might have been one of Schopenhauer's essays where he talks about this, about how often envy is expressed through these overt displays of admiration and fawning, and to actually be aware that if someone is a little too, ingratiates too much, is a little too generous with their praise, you should be wary of them. Because they're trying to get closer to you and trying to sort of maneuver in a way to find your weak spots and to undermine you. And so it's Yeah. Schopenhauer also, I mean, he had a couple of interesting points about envy. He also had this test to look for envy, where if you tell someone a piece of good news, to look for sort of a flash of disappointment in their eyes, like their eyes will often widen and have this kind of sense of shock and disappointment, and then it's a micro expression. They'll immediately correct it and attempt to hide it. So yeah, I think this is like an under discussed emotion generally. I think it's can't remember who said this. It was something like of the 7 deadly sins, envy is the one that we're least likely to confess experiencing. So, we're happy to talk about, periods of sloth and greed and lust and all those things, but envy, no one wants to acknowledge at least malicious envy, because when you acknowledge envy, you're acknowledging that you have lower status than someone else, and very few people want to want to talk about that. And you brought up the luxury beliefs thing earlier, because that is an example I've given as a luxury belief, and I guess in some ways it conflicts with what we're saying here about the luxury belief being that when we attribute so much to luck instead of hard work, this sort of undermines people's motivation to work hard. If I say, oh, it's just these invisible forces, it's the system, it's luck, it's how much money your parents have or something, rather than saying you worked really hard. If you spread that message throughout society, then people may not want to work as hard. And there's this conflict there, because I think when successful people conceal how hard they've worked and attribute it to, the modern day version of the gods, when they talk about luck or the system or whatever, that they're trying to avoid envy from their peers, from other successful people. Because I'm trying to think if I've come across any empirical work on this, but my suspicion anyway is that the more successful a person is, the more likely they are to experience envy. And one reason I say that is because there's been study after study showing that when you measure people's level of wealth and success, when you collect people's level of income and education and occupational prestige, the people who are at or near the top of those metrics are the most likely to report a strong desire for wealth and status. And there are people who are very successful are the most likely to agree with statements like, it would please me to be in a position of power over others, and it's important for me to have influence over my peers. And people who generally have that sort of strong need for status also tend to have a strong sort of feelings of envy, because if they're pursuing status and they don't have it, they get envious of others who do have it. So there's this tension here, this conflict where I would like successful people to talk more about the hard work that they've put in to their success, because I think it would spur people who are less fortunate to work hard and think, well, if that guy worked hard and got there, then maybe I could do it too. But at the same time, there's this other motive of if I talk about my hard work, then maybe I'll attract the Cassiuses and Brutuses around me and get cut down. Yeah, exactly.
It's funny that the thing about the 7 deadly sins and envy being the kind of most concealed and kind of nefarious, secretive one. The church father Basil of Caesarea, Basil the Great in the 4th century, he says, so, we often talk about, what was the first sin? Pride comes before the fall. Pride is the first sin. I think that's Augustine. But Basil says that envy is the first sin, is the devil envied God. And so he sees it as the kind of like triggering root for all the evil in the world, which I think is really interesting. But that's neither here nor there. But I think, I guess I wanted to ask you to go back to what we were talking about earlier, beneficial versus malignant or
malicious envy. Yeah.
Malicious envy. You said that malicious envy is like, the Komodo dragon fighting the other Komodo dragon because he sees he's a challenger. And it's like widespread in the animal world, these kind of dominance fights. Would evolutionary psychology back me up if I were to claim, all right, positive envy or zeal, as I like to call it, that's more of a human quality? Maybe you see it in higher primates, but is it like more uniquely human to have this positive prestige directed?
Yes, I like that question. I've never heard it put that way, but I think that's right. Yeah, that you wouldn't see that kind of desire to emulate another successful person to elevate yourself. Yeah, it's much more sort of conflict driven, more dominance driven. Um, yeah,
Because
there
prestige can be
are,
positive sum too, right? And you don't
yes.
see that so much in the animal kingdom. Anyway, go on.
Yeah. No, no, no. I think that's right. Yeah. I mean, there are sort of, I think there are glimmers of it. There are kind of signs of it, maybe in chimpanzee troops
Right.
where, you will see alliances form, but it's very kind of rudimentary. It's not sophisticated the way you would see among humans, where, two chimps who show, something like respect for one another will ally to take down a tyrannical alpha male chimp. But generally, yeah, the kind of the versions that we see of people seeing someone and using them as a role model rather than as an adversary or someone you would want to undermine. That does seem uniquely human. And yeah, I mean, generally, this is why I like evolutionary psychology, to touch on our earlier point here about, this is one branch of psychology that does attempt to look backward as well as forward
Hmm.
to try to understand human behavior, look at non-human animals, look at, other work that's been done in evolutionary biology dating back as far as Darwin of, what can we learn from the history of the evolution of the species and use that to maybe make predictions about the future.
Yeah. Well, to segue a little bit, speaking of alpha male chimps, from my own experience as a teenager, I
Hmm.
think that world describes that very well. But in your book, Troubled, which I really enjoyed, again, I really recommend it. You talk about reading biographies as
Hmm.
a big part of your development as a young man in a really difficult situation. I wonder if you'd be willing to kind of tell the audience, for those who don't know, like what your background was before you became a serviceman in the Air Force and went to Yale, et cetera. And like, what were you dealing with as a young man that biography fit into that story?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mentioned in my book Troubled this, I was inspired by these stories. So I guess, at the time I wouldn't have put it in these terms, but yeah, there may have been a sort of upward looking, prestige oriented kind of positive version of envy. But yeah, to back way up. So I was born into poverty in Los Angeles. Grew up in foster homes, never met my father, bounced around a lot. I write in my book about how, my mother came to the U.S. from Seoul, from South Korea. And so, I grew up knowing that about myself. But because I'd never met my father, I didn't know anything about that side of my family. But when I was working on the manuscript of Troubled, I did this 23andMe genetic ancestry test just because I thought, well, it might be interesting. If I learn anything noteworthy, I can put it in the book, and discovered that my father was Mexican. So I'm half
Mm.
Hispanic on my father's side. And, the joke I like to tell is, I wish I'd known that when I was applying for college. There's a friend of mine who says, Rob, before you got the results for that test, you went to bed as a white adjacent Asian American, and then the next day you got the results and became an underrepresented minority. Um, so I put the so I put
A stroke of
those, yeah.
fortune, yeah.
Yeah, it was a little late. Fortunately, things still ended up working out, but bounced around different foster homes in Los Angeles, and then I talk about getting adopted into this working class family in Northern California, very blue collar part of the state that people are not familiar with. People think of California, they think of Los Angeles, San Francisco, Silicon Valley, maybe San Diego. But if you go way up north in California, north of Sacramento, you start to get into sort of very working class, very Republican parts of the state. It's sometimes called the state of Jefferson. It's kind of like libertarian,
Hmm.
conservative, kind of pro guns but pro weed, just like pro freedom. And as an example of this, like when I visited my sister who still lives up there, and this was 2020, 2021, the height of the lockdowns, I saw no one wearing masks up there. It was like, the pandemic lasted like 3 days, and then people were like, this is not really um, worth worrying about. Um, and so, when I checked the survey data for the 2024 election, I think my county in Northern California was something like 70% for Trump. So it's, not really the California people think about.
Yeah, my last job was at Fresno State in the
Okay.
Central Valley, which is maybe a little different, not quite libertarian, but it felt like very Bible Belt a lot. It was like Christian
Yeah.
music playing in coffee shops, and it's like
Yeah.
redder than Texas,
Oh
which I
yeah.
thought was just
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah, it's a very like white working class, Hispanic working class, increasingly Hispanic working class. So yeah, you'll see Mexican guys in pickup trucks, with MAGA flags flying on the bed of the truck kind of thing. It's yeah, not I mean those were the people who, why I think Trump won the majority of the Hispanic vote, or pretty close to it. Um and so, that was the kind of milieu I was in. And I write in the book about, a lot of violence and drugs and reckless behavior. There was a lot of, divorce and drama and, financial catastrophes in my family, my adoptive family. So I fled as soon as I could. I enlisted in the Air Force when I was 17, right out of high school. And I was, really not a great student. Although I did read, you'd mentioned, I'd read memoirs and biographies. I would read, the history textbooks and practice the math exercises in math class in the books, but I would not really do homework. I was just a very unfocused, impulsive kid. So ended up enlisting, this kind of half impulsive decision. And from there went off to Yale on the GI Bill, and then off to the University of Cambridge on a scholarship where I did a PhD. And during those years, I mean, it was just I was so grateful to find myself at those institutions. In terms of the politics and the kind of social justice causes I was very annoyed by, and I write at length about those in my book, luxury beliefs and those kinds of things. But I did find ways to, get into good classes with good professors and people who helped me to, expand my knowledge base and introduce me to interesting thinkers, and use that time in grad school to read a lot and to write a lot and work on my book. And then, yeah, from there became a full-time writer, and that's sort of led me to where I am now.
Yeah, but when you talk about biographies in there, it's you don't talk about like, oh, I wanted to be like Mike Tyson or Malcolm X. It was more about the fact that here was a person who had somehow made it, but
Mm.
they had suffered greatly, and
Mhm.
this somehow kind of helped you get through your own suffering, and was
Yeah.
like therapeutic in that way.
Yeah, it was almost like the reverse of like there's like upward social comparison where people will see someone who's doing better than themselves, and they'll think it's so unfair, and you start to stew in your own bitterness of it's not, how come I don't have what that person has, and so you feel envy. But then there's the downward social comparison of, you might look at someone living in squalor on the street and think like, well, I'm having a bad day, but at least I'm not that guy. And there was a little bit of that, because my life was pretty tough when I was a kid. But then I would read about, I would read whatever, like, Mike Tyson, or I would read about Jake LaMotta, or I'd read about, some athlete from the turn of the 20th century, son of Italian immigrants or something, and they're struggling more than I was. And I would think, well, this person was able to get out of that. And I would think, well, as bad as my life is, at least I'm not going through this. And that actually helped me in some ways to place my experiences in context. Whereas now I think it's almost the reverse, where, this was the early and mid 2000s I'm talking about, but now I think even probably kids in the same circumstances that I was in, they're just looking at their smartphones, they're looking at, Instagram, they're looking at people who are doing extremely well in their lives, and not reading these in-depth textured stories of people who have risen above their circumstances. But yeah. In hindsight, like those stories were really, really important for me.
Yeah, I wonder if there is a positive emulative aspect of that, of hearing the story about somebody that whose experience you can relate to, and it helps you get through because they got through. It's not about like wanting to kind of grasp at the status that they got, but grasping at the kind of like force of character or endurance. But it does take time, right? Like you have to actually sit there with somebody and almost develop like this parasocial relationship with them. And now you just flick on to the next guy throwing a tire down, a field, or
Yeah.
arm wrestling competition, like world champion. It is just so much stimuli. You never really, those stories can never really like sink into you
Hmm.
in that medium.
Yeah,
Um,
you don't lose yourself in the same way with 15-second TikTok videos versus a 200 page biography or 300-page memoir or something of really sort of walking around in someone else's footsteps, through their mind and in that immersive way. Yeah. I mean, even movies now, I mean, it's funny. Like you would think that, okay, people aren't reading books, maybe they'll watch movies, but even movies are, young people are watching fewer of them because it takes a certain amount of attention and a certain amount of effort to focus for 2 hours, when it's much more, I guess, stimulating. But what's funny is like when this is like, it's almost like going to the gym, where if you read a book, even if you just read 2 or 3 pages, you read a chapter, when you're done, you feel good about it. You think like you feel productive. You felt like maybe you learned something and you exerted that, skill of concentration. No one feels good after watching TikTok for 30 minutes or an hour, or in some cases several hours. You feel like, one version is like how you feel before and after the gym, where maybe beforehand you're kind of dreading it, and then after you feel good. Whereas TikTok is like junk food, where in the moment it feels good, and then after you feel kind of grossed out.
Yeah, and it's like a giant box of Chips Ahoy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I related a lot to the story you told in Trouble. I mean, my youth was not nearly as troubled, as it were, but I had my parents were divorced when I was in middle school. Most of my friends were kind of in similar situations, and we, there were not a lot of like strong male role models around. There's a lot of video games, pranks, petty misdemeanors, eventually drugs, and you know, I feel like I saw where a lot of friends went, and I managed to pull myself out of that, or by grace.
Hmm.
But I think that's a big part of what motivates me in my work is trying to help an earlier version of myself get it right this time.
Hmm.
Um, but like and one of the things that I would offer my younger self is like actually just like, hey, read just biographies. It doesn't.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that it matters that it's biographies of great men like Caesar, but maybe somebody like closer to home would have been better. Do you think that there's like, would you counsel a 15-year-old in a troubled home for or against reading the biography of Alexander the Great, or what do you think would be like a good thing for a person like that?
Yeah. Well, I think for something like, it would just be any book, any book that captures your attention and interest. If the kid is already, academically inclined and enjoys reading, then yeah, I mean, it wouldn't hurt, yeah, to read stories of great men of the past. But yeah, I think for a lot of kids, they want to read something. Yeah, it's either sort of great men or people very similar to themselves. And so,
Barbell
yeah,
strategy.
yeah. That's a good way to think about it. But yeah, it's that I think, yeah, that's worth thinking about is people who've achieved astounding success, but then also people who've led more conventionally successful lives, something that's more obtainable. And I did write this book, I wrote Troubled to be accessible. If there is some number of kids out there who are interested in these kinds of stories to read about it. And, it's funny. I met a friend of mine recently, and beforehand he was like, my 11-year-old son is reading your book. And I was like, I don't know if it's kind of age appropriate for an 11-year-old, because there's a lot of swearing and violence and drug use and stuff. And he's like, oh, it's fine. And then a couple of weeks later, I met him and his son for lunch. And are we allowed to swear on on this podcast? Do you swear? Okay. Oh, okay. Well, basically, there's a story I tell in the book about how this guy he was like a vagrant who would hang out in this park in the town I grew up in, and he had "F the world" tattooed on his forehead, but like the full word spelled out. And my friend's son, who's 11 years old, says, I like that part in the book where you talked about the guy who had F the world tattooed on his forehead, but he said the full word. I'm like, all right, I don't know. Like maybe parents are just, they're just more relaxed now about what their kids are exposed to.
That's for sure. But
Yeah.
I think if they actually read the book, an 11 or 12-year-old, like it's got a really positive message, and so
Yeah. I
I
think if
would give
you're
that to a
a,
teenager.
yeah, I think if you're a reasonably bright and curious and mature 12-year-old, you could probably handle it just fine. And Yeah, I mean, I think back to when I was 11 or 12. I mean, I was reading, biographies with worse content in them. I think, yeah, one of the biographies that shook me. I was probably 13 when I read it, but the uh, the guy kind of more or less implied that he had committed sexual assault against this woman, and I was like, damn, as a 13-year-old reading something like that. And then having to sort of wrestle with like the moral complexity of like, well, I've kind of enjoyed this guy's life up until now, and now he's acknowledging this very horrible thing he did. And like no one around me, like none of my friends would have been equipped to have a conversation about something like that. And I didn't really have adults around me to talk about it with. But yeah, if you're a young kid and you read, these kinds of books and you have smart adults around you who can, you trust and can talk about, those morally complex and fraught issues with, and yeah, I can read anything.
Yeah, and I mean, history just has a lot of the badness of human nature. But
Yeah.
people used to start their kids on Plutarch younger, and Rousseau was like, I don't know, 8 or 9 when he just piled into Plutarch, and he talks about
Mm.
this in the Confessions, and um, it's like a lot of people, European aristocrats, or not even aristocrats, educated people from the West. It's like their gateway into antiquity.
Mm.
But I think it's especially for the boys. And I wanted to ask you
Mm.
about this, like, because I've looked at my analytics, and the audience is overwhelmingly male, like
Is it more
way
than
above
90%?
90, way more
Okay.
than
Okay.
90%, depending on whether you look at YouTube or Spotify. And I sometimes, which I kind of expected that. And I occasionally make a comment here or there that, shows that I recognize and expect that to be the case, that most of the
Mm.
people listening are guys. And then, a woman will comment, hey, buddy, women can like history too. Don't you think? Are we chopped liver? And so I get some pushback. So and women can be interested in history, but the statistics stand for themselves. Like, what do you think it is about history? Or there's kind of two questions. Why are men more interested in history? Is one question, and then the other question is, um, that suggests that there's a difference in emulation, in particular. That, like,
Hmm.
emulation, positive envy, is very gendered. And
Mm.
like, what does the research tell us about maybe at least one of those two questions?
When I was a teenager, I listened to this show called Loveline with Dr. Drew and Adam Carolla, and they would take these calls from teenagers and give them a relationship advice and dating advice and sometimes medical advice too. And and this was a different era. So I hope your viewers don't get too upset. But sometimes they would have this teenage girl call in who didn't really sound especially bright. And one of Carolla's favorite questions to ask these young girls was, who were the Allied and Axis powers in World War II? And they would never get this right. But then when they would ask the boys, they would always get it right. Like 100% of the time, the boys would know who were the Allies and who were the Axis powers. Girls, less than half the time, I would say, knew. Um, and yeah, and it's funny. Like, I think if you look at who majors in history at universities, I'm guessing because universities are tilting more women anyway,
Right.
that maybe there is something resembling gender parity. But then whenever I hear about something like what you're doing, or people who post lectures on YouTube, anything historically related, any online content that sort of does these deep, complex dives into historical figures, historical events, it's like overwhelmingly men who are interested. And so I do wonder if there's this mismatch between the way history is taught in universities. As you're well aware, famously the great man theory of history is out of fashion, and people are more interested in sort of impersonal forces that give rise to historical events, or leads this person or that into power.
What about the
Um,
history of prostitutes and the history of midwives? The subaltern.
Oh,
Yeah, all
yeah,
that stuff.
right. The kind of these marginalized and ignored figures, and why they're just as important as Napoleon or Caesar or something. Um, but no, I think there is something ennobling and inspiring about, great male figures, or great figures in general. I mean, I think like men are probably just as interested in, I don't know, Queen Elizabeth or something like, they're like the way that they wielded power, even if it is in a I don't know, like a more feminine or less masculine way. Men are still interested generally in people who are effective and people who get things done. And I think that is maybe a more masculine orientation of, what did this person do? Given their circumstances, given their limited means, what did they accomplish and how did they do it? And yeah, maybe there is a gender divide there where women are, less interested in kind of, concrete steps to accomplish those kinds of goals. And,
Because that's kind of the game that men tend to
yeah,
play more in the mating game. At least you have to demonstrate competence to win the
yeah.
mate. Maybe something like that. There's an evolutionary reason for that, perhaps.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. That sounds right. That, you're trying to find examples and role models and practical steps maybe that you could use in your own life and to inspire yourself to do something. And yeah, it seems like history, yeah, it has less appeal um, to women. And you see these general social survey data about practical knowledge, political knowledge, all those kinds of things, and men regularly outperform women on those things. And yeah, women have, different sets of interests, but then the way it expresses itself in, academic history as a discipline is, um, it's kind of losing its, appeal to sort of the broader public. When you look at, what academic historians are interested in now, it's, very niche, very obscure, kind of the things that you were mentioning before. And then whenever a historian does seem to break out and write something that has broad appeal, their peers within academic history will take them less seriously. And you see this kind of across different academic disciplines. I see this. I just had lunch with a psychologist friend who teaches here in New York. And she was telling me how, she's written some books that have gotten a lot of attention from the popular press, from the public. And then she's telling me about her colleagues, like, judge her for it. Like, how dare you write a book that's popular? You should be writing these niche research papers that are only read by 3 people who no one cares about. And that's all they are focused on. But then she also interestingly suggested, she thinks like part of it is just, that's not the currency in academia is popular books. They write papers. But then she also suggested there's this element of jealousy, in part because of the attention you receive. But then also, if you write a popular book, popular trade book, then you'll get invited to do public speaking gigs, for example, and you'll get paid a lot of money, especially if you have the credentials of a respected academic. And I've seen this with, historians. I was sitting in this history seminar years ago, and this kid next to me said he was reading a book by it was about Jefferson. It was David McCullough, maybe David
Hmm.
something, who wrote a book about Jefferson. And
Jonathan
this kid,
Kim wrote a book about Jefferson. Yeah, there's a few. Yeah.
okay, yeah. Well, yeah, it was one of these like very popular biographies. And this kid, says it, and the professor like, rolls his eyes, and he's like, "Why would you read something by that author? Like, it's so unserious. It's not, he's a popularizer. He's not a serious scholar." And yeah, this attitude, I think, increasingly among academics of, we're better than everyone else because, we don't care about popularity, but they're playing a different kind of status game.
Right. Yeah. You can't accuse them of being too popular because then that would reveal the fact that really it's just the tall poppy syndrome.
Yeah.
And, of course, maybe I think there is a legitimate distinction to be made between scholarship and popularizing. And I
Oh, sure.
confess that I am a popularizer, though I have been a scholar in the past. And, but so well, I wanted to ask you, well, on the history thing, just to put a bow on it, Nietzsche talks about 3 modes of reading/writing history. There's the monumental mode, which is great man history, essentially.
Hmm.
Then there's the critical mode, which is the kind where you examine institutions and show that their foundations are corrupt, and you're trying to kind of like change the social situation, the political situation. And then there's the antiquarian mode, which he is like the local expert on when King so and so built this bridge, and the second renovation of the bridge was done by Prince so and so, and all the kind of like detailed work. And he says that in his day, the scientific history community, the classics community, let's say, was all about the antiquarian mode, that they're basically, like functionaries. They're like cart pushers in the pyramid. They're not the architects of the big thing. You need them, but if they get this big head and sometimes think that they're what the real thing is, what the discipline is. But he says the real discipline is really about heroism. It's about
Mm,
not strict factual completeness or accuracy necessarily, even though truth is important, but it's really about the effect that it has on life in the present. That it's
mm,
about, inspiring. The person who can really judge the past, he says, is only the man who's building the future can really judge the
mm,
past.
mm.
It's a great treatise on the uses and abuses of history. So I think
Yeah.
that today in history departments, that mode, the monumental mode, is definitely a
Oh yeah.
no-no. It's a no-no.
Yeah.
The critical mode is okay, and the antiquarian mode is okay. I say the critical mode probably dominates, and they let the antiquarian mode exist, at least in classics departments, because it's kind of harmless.
Yeah.
But
But even
yeah,
even like I mean, I remember reading because was it the monumental mode about sort of the great
hmm
man, great figures of history. Even like that can be so inspiring to people. And I remember reading in Peter Turchin's book War and Peace and War. So he's written a series of different books, and now he's mostly known for like inter-elite conflict and elite overproduction. But he wrote this book War and Peace and War, and he there's a figure in there. He says that. Like when Napoleon was on the battlefield and he ran the numbers and said Napoleon, just having him on the battlefield was worth the statistical equivalent of an additional 30% of troops. So having sort of just having one man on the battlefield was equivalent to 30% extra troops on the battle. Like that's insane. How effective one individual can be. And, reading things like that, it does sort of push in favor of, there's something to be said for the great man theory of history, that if one individual has that much of an effect on a battle, then very clearly, if you were to replace him with someone else, then the outcome would have been much different. And I think people like, the idea of being effective, of mattering, of being irreplaceable, and it's how these things have evolved over time. Um, and how it may be, ultimately a lot of it a manifestation of this kind of envy. It's interesting.
yeah, yeah. But and you need those examples to kind of pull out your own ability to be the 20% addition by your personal presence, maybe. But when I think of heroes, I think of the dead in
Mm,
particular. There's something kind of anthropological about heroes. The true heroes in the Greek culture are, like, by definition, dead,
mhm,
and they've maybe proven themselves by the end of their lives to be sort of demigod like. Maybe they're mythological, like Achilles. I mean, I kind of tend to think Achilles is some kind of a real guy, a composite of real guys, and the Greeks
mm,
certainly thought he was a real guy. At
interesting.
least the early Greeks did. But um, I don't know. What I wanted to ask you from your own experience is, like, in the military in particular, because this seems to be a really important field for having these, like, paradigms of great achievement, great suffering, great excellence. Did you talk in the book about how you had a few role models at least, but was there a culture of honoring heroes and the dead? Was that like a big part of it in your pedagogy as a serviceman, as an airman?
Yeah, I think definitely more so than in the civilian world. You do learn a little bit about military history. So I was enlisted. So, there's the sort of two-tiered
Right.
structure of the military, where officers probably do get a more sort of in-depth education on the history of the military and notable figures and that kind of thing. Whereas enlisted, we get a more sort of potted summary of what it was. So yeah, for your listen, I'm sure many of your listeners are aware. Officers, they are sort of the leaders of the military. They typically require a bachelor's degree, go through officer training school, or you go through something like West Point or the Air Force Academy. And then the enlisted guys are usually the grunts. You go often straight out of high school, don't need a bachelor's degree, you usually require a high school diploma or in some cases a GED, go through boot camp and then kind of get your training and go straight to work. But there was this structure in place, this respect for the tradition, the history, this kind of what is it, like a lingering, or just this like nostalgia or something for, the heroes of the past, of the American Revolution through to World War One, World War Two. There's just this respect for that history that we're taught. And it's interesting because there is that interest in the history, but then in the modern day, you don't really see sort of great figures come out of the military the way that you did in the past. And I
Mm.
wonder if there is a kind of selection mechanism there in place where, essentially modern day generals are indistinguishable from politicians. In order to acquire rank, you have to kind of flatter the preferences and biases of civilian leadership, and play certain kinds of social games, and not necessarily be the most effective at war, but be the most effective at reputation management. And so, this is like we have these interesting patterns emerge where a lot of the generals who were responsible during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, they made a successful career out of writing books and public speaking and, being on the boards of various companies. And yet, depending on who you ask, both of those endeavors were failures essentially. And so it's just a different world now. And I think, there's this interesting tension where there is a respect for the military. People who join tend to, have that appreciation for the history, but then also this simultaneous awareness that the military just doesn't seem to be quite what it used to be.
Yeah. No, I kind of wondered, and I imagine there's certainly a residual culture of, the desire at least to see that nobility reflected in personal examples. But
Hmm.
yeah, you hear stories, of course, and so it's interesting to hear your experience. But well, maybe one last question. So I was thinking back about, reading Troubled and, thinking back about Plutarch heroes that have had, troubled, as it were, childhoods. And I kind of made up a back of the napkin list. So Romulus, for example, is, abandoned, orphans with his brother Remus. It's kind of the mythic Moses baby in a basket theme. They get raised by wolves. Maybe that didn't happen. Pyrrhus, the king of Epirus, definitely had a really rough childhood. His
Hmm.
father was killed when he was young, and he was sent off to live with cousins, and he sort of didn't know his parents. And he's like constantly in adoptive household situations. And I think that has a lot to do with his like constant restless warlike nature, never settled, always conquering, but never quite with a great purpose in mind, just like fighting all the time.
Hmm.
Demosthenes had corrupt guardians that he had to sue when he became of age. His dad died young. And you go down the list, Cato the Younger lost his dad, then he lost his foster dad. Alcibiades is, a lot of high mortality for the aristocratic class, which are often fighting wars. Sulla's dad, Crassus's dad, gets executed by. He's probably at about 20 when his dad gets executed by his political enemies. Caesar himself loses his dad from, guy was tying a shoe and probably had a heart attack when he's,
Hmm.
in single digits. Brutus was dad was executed by Pompey the Great after a revolt. So the Lepidin revolt. But so obviously there's a big difference between the situation of the kind of typical like abandoned orphan and raised in the foster system, you know, not sure if your parents really care about you, and like just like losing somebody to death. That's obviously different. But I think there's the point probably stands that my point is a lot of the great figures in history, and this is something I talk about with Ben Wilson some. Uh, they seem to have these like troubled childhoods,
Hmm.
John Rockefeller. Do you think that there's something about having a rough childhood that like spurs you on to to that hunger and ambition and greatness, or is it just a kind of like a selection bias? What's going on
Yeah.
there?
Yeah, there's this book on, I think it's just titled Greatness, by a psychologist named Dean Keith Simonton. and he goes through, there's a chapter in there where he goes through, a lot of historical figures and noteworthy accomplished people. And there does seem to be sort of within that subpopulation of accomplished people, a disproportionate number of them had, severely stressful childhoods. And so maybe there's a connection. I think my suspicion is that for the average person, there's probably an optimal level of stress, where if your childhood is too indulgent, then that will be bad for you. But if it's too turbulent and stressful and traumatic, that will also be bad. So there may be like sort of an optimal level of friction somewhere in the middle. But there may be, kind of, people aren't all the same. So there may be certain, personality types or people who have a certain kind of configuration of attributes that seem to thrive in especially difficult circumstances. But yeah, I don't know. Like in my case, I don't know. I tend to think that I probably succeeded in spite of rather than because of what I went through. And I wouldn't necessarily, wish if I had a kid, I wouldn't want him to go through that. But on the other hand, there is maybe something to be said for, people like those stories can be inspiring and they can lead people, I think, to great things, to overcome something, to, if you listen to some accomplished people, especially once they, reach retirement and have less sort of reputational concerns, some will acknowledge that they are inspired by, or that they were motivated by this kind of deep underlying anxiety or insecurity or this feeling of, well, I lost so much so young, and now I'm trying to overcome that feeling of scarcity by working really hard now. And, so it's one of these things where maybe it's bad for the individual, but maybe for society as a whole, it can be a good thing that people go through a lot and overcome it and accomplish great things.
Yeah, it would be one way to think of it is a kind of a species adaptation that we can, that we can bounce back in those situations. But probably not, neglect is probably not a great parenting strategy, for the record, if anybody was considering it. There's other ways to challenge your kid. Well, Rob, really enjoyed this. Thanks for coming on the show. We'll have to have you back some other time, for sure. And everybody, if you're not subscribed to Rob's newsletter, what are you doing? It's great. and Troubled is a great book for many different audiences. I think I really enjoyed reading it. So thanks for doing that. I think it's a good service actually to mankind, frankly. And keep up the good work, and we'll see you soon.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. This has been great.